It was a funeral fit for a hero, a fallen officer who had died in the line of duty. The crowd was silent, save for the occasional sniffle and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Detective Sherlock Holmes stood at the back, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place it. Rambo, the German shepherd, had been sitting quietly beside Sherlock until now. But as the coffin passed by, the dog lunged forward, barking furiously. His barks were sharp, urgent, and unlike anything Sherlock had ever heard from him before. The crowd stirred, murmuring in confusion. Sherlock tightened his grip on the leash, but Rambo pulled harder, his eyes fixed on the coffin. "Rambo, quiet!" Sherlock hissed, but the dog wouldn't stop. His barks grew louder, more desperate. The pallbearers paused, exchanging uneasy glances. Sherlock stepped forward, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Hold on," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Something's not right." The police chief, a burly man with a stern face, frowned. "Sherlock, this is a funeral. Show some respect." But Sherlock wasn't listening. He knelt beside Rambo, who was now growling low in his throat, his eyes never leaving the coffin. Sherlock's mind raced. Rambo wasn't just a dog, he was a trained K9 unit, sharp and disciplined. If he was reacting like this, there had to be a reason. "Open the coffin," Sherlock said, standing up. The crowd gasped. The police chief's face turned red. "Have you lost your mind? This is Officer Daniel's funeral. You can't just—" "Open it," Sherlock repeated, his voice cold and firm. "Now!" The tension was palpable. The pallbearers hesitated, looking to the chief for guidance. Finally, the chief nodded, his jaw clenched. "Do it. But this better be worth it, Sherlock." As the lid of the coffin was pried open, the crowd leaned in, holding their breath. Sherlock stepped closer, his heart pounding. What he saw made his blood run cold. The coffin was empty. No body, no fallen hero, just a hollow space where Officer Daniels was supposed to be. The crowd erupted into chaos, but Sherlock barely heard them. His mind was already piecing together the puzzle. Rambo's barking, the empty coffin, the timing of the funeral, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't just a funeral, it was a cover-up. Sherlock stood frozen for a moment, staring into the empty coffin. The police chief's face turned pale, and the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, blending into a cacophony of confusion and disbelief. Rambo, now silent, sat beside Sherlock, his ears perked and eyes alert, as if he knew the gravity of what they had just uncovered. "Where is Daniels?" Sherlock demanded, turning to the chief. His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the noise like a knife. The chief stammered, I don't know." "He was supposed to be here. This doesn't make any sense." Sherlock didn't believe him. He had seen that look before, the flicker of panic, the quickening of breath. The chief was hiding something. Sherlock stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You're lying. What's going on here?" Before the chief could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Detective Sherlock!" It was a young officer pushing his way through the throng of people. He looked frantic, his face flushed. "You need to see this." Sherlock followed the officer to the side of the funeral tent, where a laptop was set up on a folding table. The officer typed quickly, pulling up a series of encrypted files. "I found these on Daniels's computer. He was investigating something big, something he didn't want anyone to know about." Sherlock leaned in, his eyes scanning the screen. The files were filled with names, dates, and transactions, huge sums of money being funneled through shell companies. But what caught his attention were the names at the top of the list. High-ranking officials, including a judge, the mayor, and even the police chief. "This is a money trail," Sherlock muttered. "Daniels was onto something. He was investigating corruption at the highest levels." The young officer nodded. "And look at this." He clicked on a video file. The screen showed security footage from a warehouse. Daniels was there, talking to a man in a suit. The man handed him an envelope, and Daniels nodded before walking away. The timestamp was just 2 days before Daniels was reported dead in the line of duty. Sherlock's jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. Daniels was killed because he got too close to the truth. Rambo let out a low growl, as if sensing the danger. Sherlock glanced at the dog, then back at the officer. Where's the warehouse? It's on the outskirts of the city, the officer replied. But Sherlock, you can't go there alone. If these people are as powerful as they seem, they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. Sherlock didn't respond. His mind was already racing, piecing together the next steps. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. Daniels had sacrificed everything to uncover the truth, and Sherlock wasn't about to let his death be in vain. "Stay here," Sherlock said, grabbing the laptop, "and keep this quiet. If anyone asks, you didn't show me anything." The officer nodded, his face pale. Sherlock turned and walked away, Rambo at his side. The dog's presence was a comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. But as they left the funeral behind, Sherlock couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sherlock knelt beside Daniel's body, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. There was none. Daniels was cold, his skin pale and lifeless. But what struck Sherlock the most was the look on Daniel's face, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of shock and fear. Whatever had happened here, Daniels had seen it coming. Rambo sniffed at the body, letting out a low whine. Sherlock patted the dog's head, his mind racing. Daniels hadn't died in the line of duty. He had been murdered, and his body had been hidden here, in this abandoned warehouse. But why? What had Daniels discovered that was worth killing him over? Sherlock stood up, his eyes scanning the room. The faint light he had seen earlier came from a desk in the corner, where a single lamp flickered weakly. He walked over, Rambo following close behind, and began searching the desk. It was cluttered with papers, most of them meaningless. But one document caught his eye, a shipping manifest. The manifest listed a series of crates being transported to various locations across the city. But what stood out were the names of the recipients, the same high-ranking officials Daniels had been investigating. Sherlock's heart raced as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a money trail, it was a drug operation. "They're using the city as a distribution hub," Sherlock muttered to himself, and Daniels found out. Rambo let out a soft growl, his ears perking up. Sherlock turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing louder with each passing second. Someone was here. Sherlock moved quickly, ducking behind a stack of crates. Rambo followed, his body tense and ready to pounce. The footsteps grew closer, and Sherlock could hear voices. Gruff, angry voices. "I told you to clean this up," one man snapped. "If anyone finds that body, we're all dead." "Relax," another voice replied. "No one's going to find him here. The funeral's already over. They think he's buried." Sherlock's grip on his gun tightened. These men were part of the conspiracy. They had killed Daniels, and they were covering their tracks. He peeked out from behind the crates, catching a glimpse of two men, one tall and muscular, the other shorter and wiry. Both were armed. "We need to move the body," the tall man said. "Boss wants it gone by tonight." "Fine," the shorter man grumbled. "But I'm not touching it. You do it." The tall man cursed under his breath and walked toward Daniel's body. Sherlock knew he had to act fast. He glanced at Rambo, who was staring at him intently, waiting for a command. "On my mark," Sherlock whispered. The tall man knelt beside Daniel's body, reaching out to grab it. Sherlock stepped out from behind the crates, his gun trained on the men. "Freeze!" he shouted. The men spun around, their eyes wide with shock. The shorter man reached for his gun, but Sherlock was faster. He fired a warning shot, the bullet ricocheting off the wall behind them. "I said freeze," Sherlock repeated. "Drop your weapons." The tall man hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. The shorter man glared at Sherlock but eventually dropped his gun. Rambo stepped forward, growling menacingly, his teeth bared. "Who are you working for?" Sherlock demanded, his voice cold and steady. The tall man shook his head. "You don't want to know, detective. Trust me." Sherlock stepped closer, his gun still aimed at the men. "Try me." Before the tall man could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Sherlock glanced toward the door, his heart sinking. The police were here, but he hadn't called for backup. Someone else had. The shorter man smirked. "Looks like you're out of time, detective." Sherlock's mind raced. If the police were involved in the conspiracy, he couldn't trust them. He had to get out of here, now. "Rambo, let's go!" he shouted. The dog sprang into action, lunging at the tall man and knocking him to the ground. Sherlock took the opportunity to run, darting through the maze of crates toward the back of the warehouse. The sound of footsteps and shouting followed him, but he didn't look back. He burst through a side door, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. Rambo was right behind him, panting heavily. Sherlock glanced around, his eyes landing on a narrow alleyway. He ran toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he disappeared into the shadows, he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Daniels had uncovered a conspiracy that went all the way to the top, and Sherlock was determined to bring it down, no matter the cost. Sherlock and Rambo moved swiftly through the alleyways, sticking to the shadows. The sound of sirens grew fainter, but Sherlock knew better than to let his guard down. Whoever was behind this conspiracy had eyes everywhere, and they wouldn't stop until he was silenced. Just like Daniels. After what felt like hours of weaving through the city's underbelly, Sherlock finally reached a nondescript building on the edge of town. It was an old, crumbling structure, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. To anyone else, it looked abandoned. But to Sherlock, it was a sanctuary. He pulled out a key and unlocked the door, slipping inside with Rambo close behind. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. Sherlock flicked on a light, revealing a small, cluttered room filled with maps, files, and surveillance equipment. This was his safe house, a place he had prepared for emergencies, though he never thought he'd actually need it. Rambo sniffed around the room, his tail wagging slightly as he familiarized himself with the new surroundings. Sherlock, meanwhile, went straight to a desk in the corner and began flipping through the files. He needed to piece together what Daniels had discovered, and fast. As he sifted through the documents, one name kept appearing: Victor Kane, a powerful businessman with ties to the mayor's office. Kane had been under investigation for years, but no one had ever been able to pin anything on him. Daniels had been digging into Kane's operations, and it seemed he had found something big, something that got him killed. Sherlock pulled out the shipping manifest he had taken from the warehouse and spread it out on the desk. The crates listed on the manifest were being sent to various locations across the city, all of them linked to Kane's businesses. But what were they transporting? Drugs? Weapons? Something else entirely? Rambo let out a soft whine, drawing Sherlock's attention. The dog was standing by a filing cabinet, his nose pressed against the bottom drawer. Sherlock frowned and walked over, pulling the drawer open. Inside was a small, locked box. Sherlock's heart raced as he picked up the box. It was heavy, and it rattled slightly when he shook it. He grabbed a set of lockpicks from the desk and went to work, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. Inside the box was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Sherlock unfolded the note, his eyes scanning the words. "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. Kane's operation is bigger than anyone realizes. The crates are just the beginning. The real danger is in the lab. Find it, stop it, and whatever you do, don't trust anyone." Sherlock's hands trembled as he set the note aside and plugged the USB drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of files. He clicked on the first one, and his blood ran cold. It was a video feed from a hidden camera, showing a large, sterile laboratory. Workers in hazmat suits moved about, handling vials of a strange, glowing liquid. Sherlock leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The liquid was being poured into small capsules, which were then packed into crates, the same crates listed on the shipping manifest. "What the hell is this?" Sherlock muttered. Rambo let out a low growl, his ears twitching. Sherlock glanced at the dog, then back at the screen. The video continued, showing the crates being loaded onto trucks and driven away. But where were they going? And what was in those capsules? Sherlock's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. Daniels had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple drug operation. This was a full-blown conspiracy involving not just Kane, but also the mayor, the police chief, and who knew how many others. And whatever was in those capsules, it was dangerous enough to kill for. Sherlock stood up, his jaw set with determination. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone he could trust. But who? The police were compromised, and anyone else he reached out to could be working for Kane. As if reading his thoughts, Rambo let out a soft bark, his eyes fixed on Sherlock. The detective knelt down, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You're right, boy," Sherlock said quietly. "We're in this together, but we need a plan." He grabbed a map of the city and spread it out on the desk, his eyes scanning the streets and buildings. There had to be a way to track those crates, to find the lab and expose the truth. But it wouldn't be easy. Kane's men were watching, and they would stop at nothing to protect their operation. Sherlock's gaze landed on a location near the edge of the map, an old factory that had been abandoned for years. It was the perfect place to hide a lab. He circled it with a red marker, his mind made up. "That's where we start," he said, looking at Rambo. "But we'll need to be careful. One wrong move, and we're dead." Rambo let out a determined bark, his tail wagging slightly. Sherlock smiled faintly, despite the gravity of the situation. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, and it gave him the strength to keep going. As they prepared to leave the safe house, Sherlock couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But he had no choice. Daniels had trusted him to finish what he started, and Sherlock wasn't about to let him down. The old factory loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the night sky. Sherlock parked his car a mile away, opting to approach on foot to avoid detection. Rambo trotted silently beside him, his ears perked and eyes scanning the darkness. The air was thick with tension, and every sound, a distant owl, the rustle of leaves, felt like a warning. As they neared the factory, Sherlock noticed the faint glow of lights through the broken windows. His heart pounded. This was it. The lab Daniels had mentioned had to be here. He crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, pulling out a pair of binoculars to get a closer look. The factory was heavily guarded. Men in black uniforms patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and disciplined. Sherlock counted at least 10 guards, each armed with automatic rifles. This wasn't just a lab, it was a fortress. Rambo let out a soft whine, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Sherlock glanced at the dog, then followed his gaze to a side entrance. It was less guarded, with only 2 men standing watch. That was their way in. Sherlock reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a noise emitter. He set it to a high frequency, one that only dogs could hear, and tossed it toward the far side of the factory. Rambo's ears perked up, but he stayed silent. Moments later, the guards near the side entrance turned their heads, distracted by the faint sound. "Now," Sherlock whispered. He and Rambo moved quickly, slipping through the shadows toward the side entrance. The guards were still looking the other way, giving Sherlock just enough time to disable the security camera above the door with a well-aimed shot from his silenced pistol. He picked the lock in seconds, and they slipped inside. The interior of the factory was a maze of corridors and machinery, all of it covered in a thick layer of dust. But as they moved deeper, the air changed. It became colder, cleaner, and the faint hum of machinery grew louder. Sherlock followed the sound, his gun at the ready. They reached a heavy steel door, its surface gleaming under the dim light. Sherlock pressed his ear against it, listening. The hum was louder here, accompanied by the occasional clink of glass and the murmur of voices. This had to be the lab. Sherlock pulled out a small device from his bag, a portable EMP generator. He attached it to the door's electronic lock and activated it. The lock clicked open, and he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The sight took his breath away. The lab was massive, filled with rows of stainless steel tables and high-tech equipment. Workers in hazmat suits moved about, handling vials of the same glowing liquid Sherlock had seen in the video. The capsules were being packed into crates, which were then loaded onto a conveyor belt leading to a loading dock. But what shocked Sherlock the most was the man overseeing the operation, Victor Kane himself. The businessman stood at the center of the lab, his arms crossed as he barked orders at the workers. Sherlock's grip tightened on his gun. This was his chance to take Kane down, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Rambo let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on Kane. Sherlock patted the dog's head, his mind racing. He needed a plan. Going in guns blazing would be suicide, but he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. As he watched, one of the workers dropped a vial, and the glowing liquid spilled onto the floor. The worker cursed and quickly cleaned it up, But not before Sherlock noticed something strange. The liquid seemed to move, almost as if it were alive. "What the hell is that stuff?" Sherlock muttered under his breath. Before he could think further, a voice crackled over a nearby intercom. "Security breach detected in Sector 4. All personnel, be on alert." Sherlock's heart sank. They had been spotted. "Time to move," he whispered to Rambo. He slipped into the lab, keeping to the shadows as he made his way toward Kane. Rambo followed, his body low to the ground. They were almost within striking distance when a loud alarm blared, and the lights in the lab turned red. "Intruder!" someone shouted. Sherlock didn't hesitate. He stepped out from the shadows, his gun trained on Kane. "Freeze! It's over, Kane!" Kane turned, his eyes widening in shock. But instead of fear, a smirk spread across his face. "Detective Sherlock, I was wondering when you'd show up." Before Sherlock could react, the workers in the lab pulled out weapons, surrounding him and Rambo. Sherlock's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Rambo let out a fierce bark, his teeth bared as he positioned himself between Sherlock and the armed workers. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, and it gave Sherlock a surge of determination. "You're not walking out of here alive, Sherlock," Kane said, his voice cold. "But before you die, I want you to know something. That liquid you're so curious about? It's the future. A future you'll never see." Sherlock's grip tightened on his gun. "What is it?" Kane smiled. "A weapon. One drop can wipe out an entire city, and thanks to your friends in the police and government, it's already on its way to its targets." Sherlock's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about money or power. Kane was planning something far more sinister, a mass attack that would leave countless people dead. Before Sherlock could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the entrance of the lab. The workers turned, their attention diverted. Sherlock seized the opportunity, firing at the nearest guard and diving behind a table for cover. Rambo lunged at another guard, knocking him to the ground. Chaos erupted as more gunfire filled the lab, and Sherlock realized they weren't alone. Someone else was here, someone on their side. The gunfire intensified, echoing through the lab like thunder. Sherlock crouched behind the table, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of the chaos. Rambo was by his side, growling softly, ready to pounce at any moment. The workers and guards were scrambling, shouting orders and firing blindly into the fray. Sherlock risked a glance over the table and saw a figure moving through the smoke and confusion. It was a woman dressed in black tactical gear, her movements swift and precise. She took down two guards with ease, her gun firing in quick, controlled bursts. Sherlock didn't recognize her, but she was clearly on his side. "Who the hell are you?" Sherlock shouted over the noise. The woman glanced at him, her eyes sharp and determined. "Name's Elena. Daniel sent me." Sherlock's eyes widened. Daniels had an ally. Why hadn't he mentioned her before? But there was no time to ask questions. The guards were regrouping, and Kane was shouting orders, his voice filled with rage. "We need to get out of here," Elena yelled, ducking behind a nearby crate. "This place is rigged to blow." Sherlock's stomach dropped. "What?" "Kane's got a fail-safe," Elena explained quickly. "If the lab is compromised, he'll destroy it, and everyone in it. We've got maybe 5 minutes before this whole place goes up." Sherlock cursed under his breath. They were trapped in a ticking time bomb, surrounded by armed guards and a deadly substance that could wipe out a city. But he couldn't leave without stopping Kane. Not now. "We need to take him down," Sherlock said, his voice firm. "He's planning something big, something catastrophic." Elena nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here. But we can't do it alone. We need to get to the control room and shut down the failsafe. Then we can deal with Kane." Sherlock hesitated, his mind racing. It was a risky plan, but they had no other choice. "Where's the control room?" Elena pointed to a door on the far side of the lab. "Through there, but it's heavily guarded." Sherlock glanced at Rambo, who was still crouched beside him, his eyes locked on the guards. The dog's loyalty and instincts had gotten them this far. Sherlock knew he could count on him. "All right," Sherlock said, gripping his gun. "We move fast. Rambo, stay close." Elena gave a sharp nod, and together they sprinted toward the control room. The guards opened fire, but Sherlock and Elena returned shots, forcing them to take cover. Rambo darted ahead, his speed and agility making him a difficult target. He lunged at a guard, knocking him to the ground and giving Sherlock and Elena the opening they needed. They reached the door to the control room, but it was locked. Sherlock pulled out his lockpicks, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind them as more guards approached. "Hurry!" Elena urged, firing at the advancing guards. Sherlock worked quickly, and after a few tense seconds, the lock clicked open. They burst into the control room, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was small, filled with monitors and control panels. A single technician sat at the console, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't shoot!" the technician pleaded. "I'm just doing my job." "Shut down the failsafe," Sherlock demanded, his gun trained on the man. "Now!" The technician hesitated, his eyes darting to a red button on the console. Elena stepped forward, her voice cold and threatening. "If you don't do it, I'll make sure you regret it." The technician swallowed hard and began typing on the keyboard. The monitors flickered as he worked, and after a moment, a loud beep echoed through the room. "It's done," the technician said, his voice trembling. "The failsafe is disabled." Sherlock let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They had bought themselves some time, but the fight wasn't over yet. "Where's Kane?" Sherlock asked. The technician pointed to a monitor showing a live feed of the loading dock. Kane was there, shouting orders as workers loaded crates onto a truck. Sherlock's eyes narrowed. Kane was trying to escape, and he was taking the deadly capsules with him. "We need to stop him," Sherlock said, turning to Elena. "If those crates leave this facility, thousands of people could die." Elena nodded. "Let's move." They left the control room, Rambo leading the way. The lab was in chaos, with guards and workers running in every direction. Sherlock and Elena moved quickly, avoiding the worst of the fighting as they made their way to the loading dock. When they reached the dock, they saw Kane standing beside the truck, his face twisted in anger. He was holding a detonator in one hand, his finger hovering over the button. "Stay back!" Kane shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "I'll blow this place sky high if you come any closer." Sherlock froze, his eyes locked on the detonator. The failsafe was disabled, but Kane still had the power to destroy the lab, and everyone in it. "It's over, Kane," Sherlock said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not getting out of here." Kane laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you've won? You're too late, Sherlock. The capsules are already on their way. By the time you stop me, it'll be too late." Sherlock's heart raced. He couldn't let Kane's plan succeed. But how could he stop him without risking everything? Rambo let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on Kane. The dog's instincts were sharp, and Sherlock knew he could trust him. "Rambo," Sherlock whispered. "On my mark." Kane's finger tightened on the detonator. "Last chance, Sherlock. Back off or we all die." Sherlock took a deep breath, his mind made up. "Now!" Rambo lunged at Kane, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. Kane screamed, dropping the detonator as he struggled to shake the dog off. Sherlock and Elena rushed forward, disarming Kane and pinning him to the ground. "It's over," Sherlock said, his voice cold. "You're done." Kane glared up at him, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think this changes anything? The capsules are already out there. You'll never stop them." Sherlock's jaw tightened. Kane was right. They had stopped him, but the real fight was just beginning. The capsules were still out there, and they had to find them before it was too late. With Kane subdued and the lab secured, Sherlock and Elena knew they couldn't afford to waste a single second. The capsules were out there, and every moment they delayed brought the city closer to disaster. Sherlock quickly handcuffed Kane to a railing, ignoring the man's curses and threats. "We need to find those crates," Sherlock said, his voice urgent. "If they're already on the move, we have to track them down before they reach their targets." Elena nodded, pulling out a small device from her tactical gear. It was a GPS tracker, its screen displaying a map of the city with several blinking red dots. "Daniels planted trackers on the crates before he was killed. They're heading to 3 different locations: the mayor's office, the police headquarters, and a private airstrip outside the city." Sherlock's eyes narrowed. "The mayor and the police chief are in on this. They're planning to distribute the capsules through their networks. And the airstrip, that's how Kane was planning to export the rest." Elena's expression was grim. "We can't cover all 3 locations at once. We'll have to split up." Sherlock hesitated. Splitting up was risky, but they had no other choice. All right, you take the mayor's office. I'll handle the police headquarters. And the airstrip. He glanced at Rambo, who was standing alert beside him. Rambo and I will stop the shipment there after we're done at headquarters. Elena gave a sharp nod. Be careful, Sherlock. Kane's men will be on high alert. You too, Sherlock replied. We'll meet back here when it's done. Without another word, Elena sprinted toward the exit, her movements swift and determined. Sherlock watched her go for a moment, then turned to Rambo. Ready, boy? We've got work to do. Rambo let out a low bark, his tail wagging slightly. Sherlock patted the dog's head, then took off toward the police headquarters. Rambo close behind. The police headquarters was a fortress, its entrance guarded by armed officers. Sherlock knew he couldn't just walk in, not with the police chief involved in the conspiracy. He circled the building, looking for another way in. Rambo's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, leading Sherlock to a side entrance used for deliveries. Sherlock picked the lock quickly, and they slipped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Sherlock moved cautiously, his gun at the ready. Rambo stayed close, his ears perked and eyes scanning for danger. They reached the evidence room, where Sherlock suspected the crates were being stored. The door was locked, but Sherlock made quick work of it. Inside, they found the crates, stacked neatly against the wall. Sherlock's heart raced as he approached them, his mind flashing back to the glowing liquid in the lab. We need to destroy these, Sherlock muttered, pulling out a small explosive device from his bag. He set the timer for 5 minutes, placing the device carefully on top of the crates. Let's go. They slipped out of the evidence room and made their way back to the side entrance. As they exited the building, Sherlock heard the distant sound of shouting. The police had discovered the breach. Run! Sherlock shouted, sprinting toward his car with Rambo at his side. They barely made it inside the car before the explosion rocked the building, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the air. Sherlock didn't wait to see the aftermath. He slammed his foot on the gas, speeding toward the airstrip. The airstrip was on the outskirts of the city, its runway lit by floodlights. Sherlock parked a distance away, observing the scene through binoculars. A small plane was being loaded with crates, its engines already running. Kane's men were working quickly, their movements frantic. We need to stop that plane, Sherlock said, glancing at Rambo. But we're outnumbered. Rambo let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on the plane. Sherlock knew they didn't have much time. He grabbed a flare gun from his car and fired it into the air. The bright red light streaked across the sky, drawing the attention of Kane's men. What the? One of the men shouted, turning toward the flare. Sherlock used the distraction to his advantage, sprinting toward the plane with Rambo close behind. They reached the crates just as the men realized what was happening. Sherlock pulled out his gun, firing warning shots to keep them at bay. Rambo, guard! Sherlock shouted, tossing the dog a small device. Rambo caught it in his mouth and darted toward the plane's landing gear, placing the device carefully before retreating. Sherlock set the timer on the remaining explosives, his hands steady despite the chaos. The men were closing in, their guns trained on him. Sherlock fired a few more shots, then turned and ran, Rambo at his side. They barely made it to safety before the explosives detonated, the force of the blast knocking them to the ground. The plane erupted in flames, its fuel tanks igniting in a massive fireball. Sherlock shielded Rambo with his body, the heat searing his back. When the flames subsided, Sherlock stood up, his ears ringing. The plane was destroyed, the crates reduced to ash. Kane's operation was over. Sherlock and Rambo returned to the lab, where Elena was waiting. She had successfully stopped the capsules at the mayor's office, and the city was safe, for now. Together, they handed Kane over to federal authorities, along with the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. As the sun rose over the city, Sherlock stood with Rambo by his side, watching as Kane was led away in handcuffs. It had been a long, brutal night, but they had won. We did it, boy, Sherlock said, scratching Rambo behind the ears. Thanks to you. Rambo let out a soft bark, his tail wagging. Sherlock smiled faintly, his heart filled with a sense of relief and pride. The fight against corruption was far from over, but for now, they had struck a major blow. And as long as Sherlock and Rambo were together, they would keep fighting for justice, for loyalty, and for the city they loved.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.